This is Bigger Questions with your host, Robert Martin.
Welcome to Bigger Questions, recorded live in the city of Melbourne. Today's big question, Dystopia, what are you afraid of? Now, we're asking this question today to two people. First, to Shane Rogerson. Shane is Senior Minister of St Matt's Anglican Church in Prahran. He's passionate about engaging with the bigger questions of life, and he joins us now. Please welcome Shane Rogerson. Shane, welcome to Bigger Questions.
Thank you, Rob.
We're also asking this question today to Stephanie Gear. Now, Steph runs a Melbourne-based catering business, works part-time with City Bible Forum, and is a passionate reader, and she joins us now. Please welcome Stephanie Gear. Now, Steph, regular listeners of Bigger Questions will be familiar with you, even though this is actually your first appearance as a guest, because it's actually your voice that begins each episode of the show. So go on, can you give us maybe a demo, Steph, just to tell us, see the face behind or hear the voice behind the voice, maybe.
Okay, I'll do my best.
Give us a go. How does
This is Bigger Questions with your host, Robert Martin.
That's pretty, yeah.
Very good.
And then everyone usually cheers and there's uproarious applause, etc.
Fabulous.
Actually, what do you think, Shane? Was that all right?
Very good. Very good.
Good. So to kick off Bigger Questions, we like to ask a couple of smaller questions. We do try to have a bit of fun on the show. Though given the nature of our topic today, fun may be a little bit hard to find. But we do acknowledge that today's conversation may raise some disturbing ideas. Now, today we are asking Shane Rogerson and Steph Gear about dystopia, particularly that found on our popular TV screens. So, Shane and Steph, I thought we'd test you on how much you know about dystopian fiction. Now, do you feel qualified at all?
A little bit.
A little bit? What about you, Steph? You feel like
I think less than Shane.
Okay, right, okay. Well, there's two questions, both multiple choice. We'll see how you go. Question one. Which of the following books would not be generally understood as dystopian fiction? Is it A, The Hunger Games, B, 1984, C, The Handmaid's Tale, or D, Where's Wally?
Oh, dear.
So which of the following would not be generally understood as dystopian fiction? So, Shane, maybe you can...
I was going to phone a friend on this one. I'm going to say Where's Wally, although I would think there are better dystopian fictions than others, and I'd put Hunger Games down the list.
Sure. Anyway, well, that says more about you, perhaps, Shane. Anyway, I love the Hunger Games. What about you, Steph? You're going to...
I would agree with Shane, given my limited reading of dystopian fiction, but my extensive reading of Where's Wally. I would put D, please, as the answer.
And that's correct, yes. Well done. Okay, question two.
We're really sweating now.
Yeah. Which of these fiction books has sold the most copies? Is it A, The Hunger Games, B, 1984, C, The Handmaid's Tale, or D, Where's Wally? So which of those fiction books has sold the most copies? Shane.
I'm going to go on the historical perspective and say Orwell's been around longer, and so it's probably 1984.
Okay, right.
Although there's been a massive resurgence in Handmaid's Tale since the
TV series was released. Yep. Okay, so you're going to go for the A and C, is that right? Sorry, B and C, or just B?
I go B, maybe C.
Okay, what about you, Steph? Which one are you going to go? Hunger Games, 84, Handmaid's Tale, or Where's Wally?
Maybe I'll be controversial and go with D again. I'm going to say that Where's Wally is popular, really popular.
Well, you're both right in that they're both popular, but the answer actually is, well, B or A, depending on which facts or alternative facts you kind of wanted to believe. Because 1984 has sold 30 million copies and is the number one bestseller, but The Hunger Games has sold $65 million copies as the trilogy. So all three of them have sold more copies, but 1984. So the correct answer is actually B. The Handmaid's Tale was the most read book of 2017, but hasn't quite caught up to the astronomical scales of the other books yet. And Where's Wally has only sold a mere 55 million books, but in 13 books. So he sold more than 1984, but less than The Hunger Games. So perhaps, you could perhaps be both correct in some way. So everyone wins. It depends on which facts or alternative facts you get. Anyway, Shane and Steph, Big Brother may be watching, and he would be pleased because you both passed. You got one or two out of our smaller questions right. Big round of applause.
Well done.
Well, dystopia, it's very, very popular, but what do you think would make something dystopian?
Well, dystopian means a bad place or not in a good place. And I thought about this beforehand. I think it's a dystopia in terms of the literature and the movies. It's the worst imaginings of ourselves as a cautionary tale in a not too distant future.
Okay, right. And would you have anything to add to that, Steph, or is that?
To a certain extent, it's the contradiction of utopia, the idea being popularised by Sir Thomas More in the 1500s when he wrote a book about a utopian society. So it was very low crime, good food, good health, everybody got along.
Just sort of the subversion of a utopia.
Yes.
This is a dystopia.
Indeed.
Right, okay, yeah. Well, at the start of 2017, the book 1984 experienced a resurgence of sales, with sales jumping 9,500%, and the book jumped to number 1 on the Amazon bestseller list. Now, the book was published 70 years ago, so why do you think it's made such a comeback? Steph?
I read an article about this just recently. Apparently, the sales of the book went through the roof, requiring another print run after the White House press secretary Kellyanne Conway used the phrase alternative facts in a speech that she gave on television.
So what do you think that means? What's the connection there with 1984?
I guess the people who perhaps had read the book as a high school text or were familiar with it from their younger days noticed a similarity or resonated with that phrase that she used, and they were suspicious of it.
I think partly the unprecedented power of the United States of America, the potential for it to become a totalitarian state, its ministry of love exhibited in the prison camps of Abu Ghraib, alternative truths and propaganda. It's raised a lot of concerns and really prodded the fears of people who worry about absolute power corrupting absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. What do you think that attracts people to dystopia? What particularly do you think attracts people to it?
Well, I think we have fears. Part of the very nature of humanity is we're a whole mixture of hopes and fears and visions and dreams. And so we're motivated by our fears, and the thought of our fears coming to reality is quite palpable, and therefore we're drawn into the possibilities of those fears becoming real.
And that's where dystopia would sort of reflect that.
Absolutely.
And animate that.
Yeah.
Yep, Steph?
I just found it interesting as a genre. Dystopian fiction didn't really take off until after World War II, where that idea of living in a disjointed and restricted society had been the experience for the Western world, and so they could empathise with the themes of dystopia.
People are recognising that life is chaotic and disjointed and unravelled, and dystopian fiction very much appeals to that sense of life unravelling and becoming something of what we experience.
So life feels more like a dystopia than a utopia, perhaps.
That's
right. Right, yeah. So then do you guys like dystopian fiction?
I love it. I sit down every Thursday night with my wife to watch a dystopian television series.
Yep.
I've read lots of dystopian stuff from Huxley to Orwell to others. So I love it. I find it fascinating because I like that idea of exploring not only the possibility of a great future, but also what would a terrible future look like.
Yeah, yeah. How about you, Steph? Do you like dystopian fiction?
I don't like dystopian fiction.
No?
I find it challenging to read. I haven't sought out dystopian fiction to read. Every dystopian book that I've read has been a recommendation or a prescribed text.
Right, yeah. So why do you find it challenging? You prefer utopias?
I think I do,
Right.
yes. Even Thomas Hardy I find a challenging read because often you don't have a happy ending.
Well, English literature academic Rob McAleer claimed that if the persuasive strategy that governs utopias is hope, for dystopias is fear. Is this true?
The nature of a dystopia is when life unravels.
Yeah.
And whatever we idealise, it's the opposite of that. So it's our worst imagining. So, yeah, fear is massive. That as you enter into the world of these dystopias, you start to go, oh my goodness, imagine what would happen to my children, what would happen to me, what would happen to the people I care about if that happened.
So what particular fears then do you think dystopia sort of taps into?
I would say the fear of being unable to express yourself as an individual, the idea of loss of identity, perhaps, loss of hope. What do you think, Shane?
Well, dystopias often have totalitarian states, and so freedom is a key theme in dystopian stories. So usually the hero or heroines in the story are those who are fighting for freedom of the individual against the state, against Big Brother, the I, whoever it may be.
Yeah.
But there's also other issues in terms of control, how information is used, whether you can actually access truth anymore.
Yeah.
A whole number of things.
So, I mean, these are legitimate fears, though, I suppose, and perhaps in some people's minds feel that those fears are being enacted today in our world. I mean, would that be reasonable, that these are actually legitimate fears?
Well, you do see totalitarian dictatorships prop up in the world. So if you just watch the news and you look at the rise of ISIS in the Middle East and just how appalling women and children and minority groups were treated by this fundamentalist totalitarian regime. And it's horrifying to think that, that could happen in our day and age, yet it is as we speak. And so to think of that closer to home in the not too distant future, I think really taps into a fear.
It's quite terrifying, yep, Steph.
Even currently, the loss of privacy is a fear that a lot of us in the Western world would have. Information that we have presumably securely stored being accessed by those who don't have permission.
Yes, yeah. So why do you think then fear is so powerful?
Because the thing that is presented in your fear is a potential reality. So if I think about letting my daughter walk home from a late shift at McDonald's with the knowledge that people are out on the streets potentially going to harm her, it's a real potential fear. And so I think, do I get an Uber? Do I get a taxi for her? Do I stay up late and pick her up? Because it's a real fear because of its potent.
Yeah.
And the thing about these fears, they're real fears. They're not things like phobias that are not based in reality. But there's a semblance to it, the possibility of it actually happening.
Now, religion can also be a force used to intimidate and to control, as seen in the recent award-winning dystopian TV series The Handmaid's Tale. Now, Steph, you read the book as a high school text and you've watched the TV series. So what did you make of it? Did you enjoy it? I mean, it's dystopian, so perhaps not, but what did you make of it?
The television show itself is beautiful to watch. It's well made. I feel it tells the story of the book by Margaret Atwood well.
But it's an adult-only kind of TV show, though, really, isn't it?
Yes. But I still find it challenging. I was interested to watch it, given that I read the book in high school. I was interested to see how it was treated as a visual story rather than just literature. But I'm not sure that I would watch it again.
Right. It was jarring. It was challenging.
It was,
perhaps.
yes.
Yeah. What particularly made it challenging for you?
It made me very uncomfortable to think that this was even remotely possible. The behaviours of all of the people involved, the involvement of the commander's wife in enabling a system where women were oppressed, that there weren't more people who stood up and disagreed with it.
But did it make you uncomfortable that it was sort of a religious group that were restricting women and basically enslaving them to be concubines for the furtherance of the kingdom, so to speak?
Yes, it did. I found that given any Bible knowledge that I had, I found that my radar was always switched on. When I heard them referencing Old Testament verses, I would try and think about that in context of where it occurred in the Old Testament and whether their use of it was accurate. And so I was always thinking, is what they're saying true? Is what they're saying fair? Is what they're saying real? And usually it wasn't.
So you felt it was a distortion or something of
Yes.
what you think the Bible actually says?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
So it was deeply dehumanising of women. So one of the most disturbing things about The Handmaid's Tale is that women are treated as a subspecies and a commodity.
Yeah.
Which is so counter to a biblical worldview, which is a fundamentally egalitarian text that gives great dignity and worth to women. But just to see how women could possibly be treated in this, what really is a sort of neo-Puritan, theonomistic society. So I'll explain that. It's kind of portraying a type of Christian fundamentalism, although I don't think it's so much got its sights on Christianity, but fundamentalism per se.
Right.
And it's kind of this reconstructionist world where they're trying to go back to some Puritan age, which is establishing power, the power of men and patriarchy. But the thing about it is that it's such a misrepresentation of any kind of biblical worldview, and at times they do borrow from biblical expressions and texts, which means a person who is antagonistic towards Christianity, and particularly if they've grown up in maybe North American fundamentalist Christianity, it very much gives them something to rail against.
Sort of latch onto that and say this is what a totalitarian Christian state would look like or should look like. Yeah. But both of you would say that's kind of a distortion of what a true Christian perspective would be.
Certainly, in my experience, yes.
Yeah. So in The Handmaid's Tale then, so what do you think people are afraid of? Is it patriarchy, or is it religion, or is it a combination of both?
To understand Margaret Atwood in the original novel, when she wrote it, she wasn't even writing it as a feminist, but she was writing it as a person who was concerned about how patriarchy was abusive in its use of power. And so there's definitely the sights are set on patriarchy and the abuse of power. Although I think in the modern setting of 2018, when in North America with the rise of the right, with certain political trends there, particularly women's rights, reproductive rights and those kind of things, and repealing of laws that were in place, The Handmaid's Tale became a cautionary tale for feminists, to say all the great liberties that women have achieved and attained could possibly be overturned or set back in this kind of this neo-fundamentalist future.
So what's your reading then, Steph? Patriarchy, religion, combination of both?
I don't think it's either.
Right.
I think it's a story about fear and about the loss of identity, the loss of expression, the loss of certain freedoms.
Right. So at the core of dystopia then is a fear of, or loss of identity, loss of control and of freedom. So then what does true freedom then look like?
Well, if you go into the story of the dystopian tale, freedom is to throw off these shackles of oppression, to fight against it, to say no to these totalitarian powers and those who seek to control and dehumanise. In one sense, it's a cautionary tale for those who live in the utopia, that is where there's all these perceived privileges in terms of individual freedoms, reproductive freedoms, sexual freedoms, although I think that's where I'd want to pull back a little bit, because I don't think the answer to freedom is to have absolutely no constraint.
What are your thoughts, Steph?
Yeah, freedom is the idea of liberty, liberty of thought, liberty of practice. But if you take that liberty too far, you leave yourself open to all sorts of evil.
So you can also, true freedom can be almost as bad as true oppression, perhaps, or you don't want to push it too far.
There's another dystopian tale that does that in A Clockwork Orange, where he just goes for violence and sex and drugs as much as he possibly can, and you see how destructive it is. So I don't think that's the answer. The answer is that true freedom is actually found in the right constraints. And I often think of the goldfish. A goldfish is in the bowl. It could say, I want to be free, and so it jumps out of its environment, the goldfish bowl, and onto the carpet. And it will very quickly die because it needs certain constraints in which to flourish. And so the answer to freedom is not entirely throwing off constraints, but finding the right constraints in which we can truly flourish.
So how do you find the right constraints?
One of the things that the dystopian stories do is they do get us thinking about what is true freedom, what does it mean to find my true identity, and obviously I would say as a Christian that it's finding the constraints that help life to flourish best. And that's not to totally remove all authority, but to find the right authority, or if you like, a benevolent authority. And I've become convinced that that's finding the right constraints in relationship to my Creator, a Heavenly Father who loves me and is for me, and gives me constraints that are actually good and for my flourishing.
We were thinking in discussing this about stories and how stories allegories can help us understand in a way that we hadn't realised before. And I was thinking about the proverbial story of the princess in the tower and how she needs a knight to come and rescue her. And recently we've seen stories like Shrek where, yes, she gets rescued, but then you've got the other idea where she is given the skills to rescue herself. She is taught that that's the right thing to do, which is all well and good. But in the biblical narrative, if we are the princess in the tower, we have no ability, no skills, no way of ever rescuing ourselves. And so we need to be rescued, and our Father sends his best knight to come and rescue us. And that's how we are freed. And that's how she knows that she is loved by her Father, because he sends his knight. But that's also the constraint. If she wasn't rescued, if she had no father, if she had no knight, is that absolute freedom?
If you're a feminist listening to that, they might push back and say that's a very patriarchal narrative.
It is, yes.
One of the things when you watch The Handmaid's Tale is you look at the kind of men that are in that story and you go, that is not the kind of man I would want to be or desire, because even in the way they go about using their power, they themselves are being dehumanised. And so one of the things I think that these narratives do is they get us longing for a person who is truly human, a person who actually doesn't use their power to abuse others, but uses their powers to bless and help others to flourish. And so in that story, I think it gets us longing for a true man, a true human who won't ever use their power other than for the good of others. And I think in the story of the gospel, we actually find that person.
This week's big question is about dystopia. What are we afraid of? In the New Testament book of 1 Peter, the author, Peter the Apostle, writes a letter to a group of Christians scattered across the ancient world. He writes in chapter 3, verses 13 to 14, he says, "Who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good? But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed." So, Shane, it sounds like the recipients of this letter are suffering in some way. What was their particular situation?
Well, he was writing to Christians who were in the jaws of a very powerful state.
Almost a totalitarian state.
Almost in a totalitarian state where there was a significant curtailment of their freedom. And what Peter wants them to realise is that although that circumstance is one which he would prefer them not to be in, their happiness, their joy, their flourishing is not dictated by that circumstance, because it's dictated by who they're in relationship to, who is their God. And therefore they can actually live, even in the worst of circumstances, although they may want to change it, they can live in that circumstance not subjugated by that fear, because they have a greater fear of the one who is sovereign even over that terrible circumstance.
Well, Peter goes on then to exhort his recipients amidst their difficulties by saying, "Do not fear their threats, do not be frightened, but in your hearts revere Christ as Lord." So why shouldn't they fear? What reason does he have to offer to overcome fear?
What I think Peter wants his listeners, including us, to understand is that whatever might threaten to overcome us in our fears, there is one more glorious, one more greater than those things that we fear. And therefore, any fear that we have will be subordinated and brought into balance by one who we fear, who is Christ as Lord. And therefore his greatness, his goodness, his fear subordinates all those other fears.
But he does say revere Christ as Lord. So, Steph, isn't it a scary prospect to revere someone as Lord?
It depends how they use that relationship with you. If they use it for your good, then surely it's lovely. If you have someone who's there to protect you, to care for you, to help you with your fear, then that's someone that I want on my side.
And do you think Jesus is that one for you?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
In what ways has he helped you, protected you?
I struggle with panic attacks to the point where, I'm driving in the car and I panic to the point where I get tunnel vision and I honestly cannot see what I am doing. I don't know whether to slow down and stop right where I am. I don't know whether to pull over. The idea of being hit by another car, you don't know when it's going to happen. You can't see it coming. And one of the most reassuring things is it's just my physical body. And if it was to die, then heaven is on the other side. And that is really comforting.
So having Christ as your Lord fills you with great comfort and
it sure
peace
does.
and allays your fears in some ways.
It does.
In 1984, Big Brother was depicted as an infallible and all-powerful, omnipotent leader. And some have drawn connections between Big Brother and God, a large masculine deity who is always watching you and demands you unconditionally love and obey him. So isn't obeying Jesus as Lord a kind of a patriarchal, controlling submission?
He is all-knowing, he is all-powerful, and he is ever-present. But he's one who I'm confident never uses his power in any other way than for my good.
Which perhaps, Steph, is a bit different to the leaders of Gilead or Big Brother, perhaps, that it doesn't necessarily have your best interests at heart?
Indeed, yeah. I got to the end of 1984 and I was so surprised by the ending that our hero, Winston
Smith.
Yes, that he only loved Big Brother because he had no other relationships. All other human contact was removed. He was an alcoholic. And that's not God's character at all. God desires us to have friendships, to have relationships, and that's a reflection of his love for us.
Mm-hmm. That's what it means to have Christ as Lord.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Shane and Steph, as we've thought about dystopia today, what are you afraid of? Maybe we'll start with you, Steph.
Public speaking?
I could say, in relationship to dystopia, I do think we need to take these cautionary tales on board and say, I never want to be the type of man who would ever abuse the powers and responsibilities that have been given for me, but only ever use them for the genuine blessing and flourishing of others. Because to do anything other than that is to actually become part of that dystopia where life unravels. But I will fail in that at times, so I can know that I can look to the one who never lets us down, who never lets life unravel, because he always uses his power perfectly for my good, and I can entrust myself to him, and that subordinates all fears that I have. That's great news.
Let me leave you with the Bible's answer to the big question, what are you afraid of? From 1 Peter chapter 3. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened, but in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. I look forward to you joining us next time for bigger questions. Please thank our guests today, Shane Rogerson and Stephanie Gear.
Enjoy bigger questions? You can help us keep asking them for as little as $1 a podcast. Support the show. Go to patreon.com/biggerquestions.